Would you like me to translate everything you just said for my father? My fork stopped halfway to my plate. The room went silent. Across the table, my fiancé's mother stared at me as if I had suddenly become a stranger. His father lowered his wine glass. My fiancé, Daniel, turned completely pale, and my father, he was still smiling, completely unaware that the people sitting across from him had spent the last 20 minutes tearing him apart in French. I looked directly at Daniel. You thought I couldn't understand you, I said quietly. That was your first mistake. 3 hours earlier, I had been excited about dinner. My name is Claire Morgan, and at 31, I was a U.S. Army captain stationed at Fort Liberty, North Carolina. Military service had taught me to stay calm when everything around me was chaotic, listen carefully, and never make decisions based solely on emotion. That evening, however, I had no idea those lessons were about to become very personal. Daniel's parents had flown from France to the United States to meet my family before our wedding. They were sophisticated, wealthy, and perfectly polite. His mother, Isabelle, kissed my cheek and told me she had heard wonderful things about me. His father, Laurent, shook my hand firmly and said, "We are very happy to finally meet the woman our son intends to marry." I smiled. My father, Robert Morgan, stood beside me in his best navy blazer, slightly nervous but trying not to show it. Dad was 64. He had spent his working life as a high school history teacher and later as a guidance counselor. He lived in the same modest house where I had grown up. The kitchen cabinets were old, the driveway had cracks, and his truck had more miles than I could count. But that house had always been home. My father had raised me after my mother died when I was 17. He worked extra hours, learned how to cook badly, sat through my late-night college applications, and never once complained when I told him I wanted to join the army. He wasn't rich, but he had given me something I considered priceless. He had taught me that a person's character mattered more than their bank account. Dinner began beautifully. We ate at a quiet restaurant outside Fayetteville, with warm lighting and tables far enough apart to hear one another. Daniel sat beside me. Dad sat across from us. His parents sat together on the other side. For the first hour, everything felt normal. They asked Dad about his career. He told them funny stories about students he had taught over the years. He talked about my childhood. He even embarrassed me by describing how I once tried to build a backyard obstacle course because I wanted to be a soldier before I was old enough to understand what that meant. Everyone laughed. Then dessert arrived. Daniel's father leaned toward his wife and spoke in French. I understood every word. I had learned French years earlier during my military career. I wasn't fluent enough to write a novel in it, but I could follow a conversation easily, especially when people assumed they didn't need to be careful. At first, I ignored them. I assumed it was private. Then, Isabelle glanced toward my father and said something that made my stomach tighten. She called him simple. Not simple as in kind, but simple as in beneath them. Laurent laughed. Then he said that it was difficult to understand why someone like Daniel would marry into a family with so little social standing. I looked at Daniel. He heard every word. He didn't correct them. He didn't even look uncomfortable. That hurt more than their insults. I kept my face calm. Then Isabelle said something about Dad's house. She wondered whether it was really worth keeping. Laurent answered that it would eventually become our family's concern if Daniel and I married. My hand tightened around my fork. Then they went further. They joked about Dad's old truck. They mocked his clothes. They questioned whether he had enough money to contribute to the wedding. And then Laurent said the sentence I would never forget. He should be grateful his daughter married into a better family. Daniel laughed. Not loudly, just enough. That tiny laugh broke something inside me. I looked across the table at my father. He was telling Daniel's mother about the first time put on my army uniform. His eyes were shining with pride. He had no idea they were insulting him while he spoke. I remembered every sacrifice he had made. Every night he waited for me to call after deployment. Every time he told me he was proud of me, even when I knew he was terrified. And suddenly, I realized something. I wasn't angry because they thought Dad was poor. I was angry because they believed money gave them permission to disrespect him. I placed my fork gently on the plate. The sound was small, but everyone heard it. Daniel stopped smiling. I looked at his parents and spoke in French. Your French is very good. Isabel's face changed instantly, I continued. Unfortunately for you, so is mine. Nobody moved. Daniel whispered. Claire, I turned toward him. You knew they were talking about my father. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His mother tried to laugh it off. Oh, Claire, you misunderstood. No, I said I understood every word. Dad finally looked at me. Claire, what's going on? I reached across the table and touched his hand. Nothing you need to worry about, Dad. Then I looked back at Daniel. His face had gone pale. I could have exposed every insult and humiliated them in front of the entire restaurant, but I remembered what my father had taught me. Anger tells you what hurts. Character tells you what you do next. So I took a breath. Then I asked the question that changed everything. Before we continue discussing my father's worth, would you like me to translate everything you just said for him? Daniel's mother stopped up breathing for a moment. His father lowered his eyes, and for the first time that evening, nobody at that table had anything to say. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then my father looked from me to Daniel and back again. Claire, he said softly, what exactly did they say? I squeezed his hand. Dad, they were speaking French because they thought I couldn't understand them. His eyebrows lifted. You speak French. I've picked up quite a bit over the years. Daniel finally found his voice. Claire, this isn't what you think. I looked at him. That sentence usually means it is exactly what I think. His father straightened in his chair. We were discussing family matters privately. There was no intention to offend. I almost laughed. Then why were you discussing my father's house, his finances, and what he might leave me after he dies? That ended the argument. My father's face changed. Not anger, hurt. He slowly pulled his hand away from mine and looked down at the table. I knew that expression. My father had spent his entire life avoiding being a burden to anyone. The last thing he wanted was to believe the people sitting across from him saw him as one. Dinner ended shortly afterward. There was no dramatic scene in the restaurant, no shouting, no raised voices. I simply told the server we would be leaving. Outside, the North Carolina air was warm and heavy. Cars moved through the parking lot, headlights cutting through the darkness. Dad stood beside me near his truck. Are you all right? He asked. I almost smiled. That was my father. His daughter had just discovered her future in-laws had insulted him, and somehow his first concern was whether I was okay. I should be asking you that. He shrugged. I've been called worse by teenagers. I laughed despite myself. Then his expression became serious. Claire, don't make a decision tonight because you're angry. I stared at him. Dad, they insulted you. They did. And Daniel laughed. He looked away. That part bothers me more. I knew exactly what he meant. It wasn't the French. It wasn't the money. It was Daniel's silence. For nearly 3 years, I had believed Daniel was the man I would spend the rest of my life with. We met at a charity event in Raleigh. He had been working for a technology consulting company, and I had been helping organize a veterans fundraiser. He was charming without being pushy, ambitious, without seeming arrogant. When I told him I was in the army, he said he admired my discipline. When I introduced him to Dad, he brought a bottle of wine and spent nearly 2 hours listening to stories about my childhood. At least that's what I thought. Over time, I began noticing small things. Daniel never liked eating at Dad's house because he thought the kitchen was too cramped. He once joked that Dad's truck belonged in a museum. When Dad offered to help us pay for part of the wedding, Daniel smiled and said, "We'll see." I had dismissed those moments. I told myself Daniel simply had different tastes. I told myself his family had grown up differently. And whenever Dad mentioned it, I defended Daniel. He's not trying to be disrespectful. That night, I wondered how many times I had said those words because I wanted them to be true. Daniel approached us in the parking lot. "Claire, can we talk?" Dad looked at me. "I'll wait in the truck." "No," I said, "you don't have to leave." Daniel stopped. "Your father doesn't need to be involved in this." I looked at him carefully. "My father became involved when your family started discussing his life behind his back." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "My parents were nervous. They were trying to understand your family's financial situation." "Why?" "Because we're getting married." "That doesn't answer my question." He hesitated. Then he said, "Marriage involves money. So does buying a house. So does retirement. So does having children. None of that gives your family the right to investigate my father. He looked toward Dad's truck. They weren't investigating him. I stared at him. Then what do you call asking how much his property is worth? Daniel had no answer. Finally, he said, "My parents were worried that you were going to be responsible for him financially." The words landed harder than I expected. I turned toward my father. He was sitting behind the steering wheel, looking straight ahead. I felt ashamed, not of him, of myself, because somewhere along the way, I had allowed someone else's definition of success to make me question the man who had given me everything. Daniel stepped closer. "Claire, I love you." I looked at him. "Then you should have defended him." I didn't know what to say. "You knew what they were saying." He lowered his voice. "I didn't want to start a fight." I nodded slowly. "That tells me everything." He looked confused. "What does it tell you that keeping the peace mattered more to you than protecting the person who raised the woman you're planning to marry?" Daniel's expression hardened. "You're making this bigger than it is." I felt something inside me go completely still. That sentence reminded me of every briefing I had ever attended. In the military, you learn quickly that small problems rarely remain small when everyone keeps pretending they don't exist. I had seen how ignored warnings could become emergencies, and now I was looking at my own life the same way. "I need space," I told him. "Claire." "No." He stopped. "I don't want another explanation tonight." Dad finally opened the truck door. I walked over and hugged him. He held me tightly. "You don't have to protect me from everything," he whispered. "I know." "Then don't let this become about me." I pulled back and looked into his eyes. "It isn't about you, Dad." He waited. "It's about what kind of man I almost married." That night, I drove home alone. Daniel sent 7 messages before midnight. The first said he was sorry. The second blamed his parents. The third said he had been embarrassed. The fourth said I was overreacting. The fifth disappeared. The sixth simply said, "Please don't do this." The seventh came at 1:13 a.m. "You don't understand how my family works." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then I put my phone face down. The next morning, I went to the base as usual. Training, paperwork, meetings. Everything looked normal. But my mind kept returning to one question. Why did Daniel's family know so much about my father's finances? I had never told them. Dad certainly hadn't. And when I thought about the questions Daniel had been asking me during the previous 6 months, a pattern began to emerge. How much was Dad's house worth? Did he have a retirement account? Was there life insurance? Had he made a will? At the time, I thought Daniel was simply planning for our future. Now, I wasn't so sure. That evening, when I returned home, I found Daniel's jacket still hanging in my entryway. I picked it up, and something hard slipped from the inside pocket onto the floor. It was a plain white envelope. My name wasn't on it, neither was Daniel's, but when I opened it, my hands went cold. Inside were property records for my father's house. And suddenly, I understood that dinner hadn't been about meeting my family. They had come to America to find out what my family was worth. I stared at the property records spread across my kitchen table. For several minutes, I couldn't move. The documents weren't originals. There were photocopies of county property records, including the estimated value of my father's house, the lot size, and the date he had purchased it. There was also a handwritten note in the margin. "Confirm inheritance arrangements." My stomach tightened. That wasn't curiosity. That was planning. I sat down and read everything again. The house wasn't worth a fortune. It was a comfortable 3-bedroom home in a quiet North Carolina neighborhood. Nothing luxurious. Dad had bought it decades ago and had spent years paying it off. But to someone looking at numbers from a distance, it was an asset. And apparently that was how Daniel's family had begun seeing my father as an asset. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't call his parents. Instead, I did what military training had taught me to do when something didn't make sense. I gathered facts. I photographed the documents and put the originals back exactly where I had found them. Then I checked my phone for old messages. At first, I found nothing unusual. Then I started searching for conversations about money. There they were. 6 months earlier, Daniel had asked casually whether my father planned to stay in his house after retirement. 5 months earlier, he had asked whether Dad had good insurance. 4 months earlier, He had asked whether I was the beneficiary of any of my father's accounts. 3 months earlier, he had joked about how property in America can become complicated when families merge. At the time, I hadn't thought anything of it. Now, every sentence looked different. I scrolled farther. Then, I found a message from Daniel's mother. It was sent to Daniel, not me. She had written, "You need to know what Claire will actually inherit before you make any permanent commitments." I read it twice, then a third time. My hands were shaking. The woman who had hugged me at the airport and called me dear had been discussing my inheritance before my wedding had even taken place. I put the phone down. For the first time since the dinner, I cried. Not because of the money, because I realized how badly I had wanted to believe Daniel was different from his family. That was the part that hurt. I had spent years in the army learning that trust wasn't something you gave blindly. You earned it through consistency. But with Daniel, I had done the opposite. I had trusted his words and ignored his patterns. The next morning, I drove to Dad's house. He was in the garage trying to fix the old lawnmower. "It's supposed to be a simple repair," he said. I looked at the collection of tools scattered around him. "You've been saying that for 40 years. He smiled. Then he noticed my expression. "What happened?" I sat on an overturned bucket. "I found something." He stopped working. I showed him the photographs. His face became serious. "Where did you get these Daniel's jacket?" Dad wiped his hands on an old rag. "Are you sure he knows about this?" "I don't know." He looked at the documents again, then he sighed. "Claire, don't let anger make you accuse someone without knowing the whole story." "I know." "Good. But I'm going to find out." Dad looked at me for a long moment, then he nodded. "That sounds more like you." I spent the next several days quietly putting together the timeline. I discovered that Daniel had asked me more questions about Dad's finances after our engagement. He wanted to know whether Dad had a will. He wanted to know if I had any siblings. He asked whether I expected to move into Dad's house someday. Then came the strangest question of all. If something happened to your father, would you have to sell the house? I remembered sitting beside Daniel on our couch when he asked it. I had laughed. "Why are you asking me that?" He kissed my forehead just thinking about our future. I believed him. Now I understood why that memory made me uncomfortable. One evening I finally called him. "Daniel, we need to talk." His voice immediately changed. "Are you okay? Where did you get the property records for my father's house?" Silence. Not the silence of someone confused. The silence of someone caught. "Claire, answer me." "My father asked someone to look into the property." "Why?" "He wanted to understand your family's financial situation." "That's not what I asked." Daniel exhaled. "Because my parents wanted to know whether your father had significant assets." I closed my eyes. "And you helped them." I didn't think it was a big deal. I laughed once. It wasn't a happy laugh. "You didn't think it was a big deal to investigate my father without his knowledge. They were trying to protect us." "No. They were trying to calculate us." "That isn't fair." "Then explain the note." "What note?" I read it aloud. "Confirm inheritance arrangements." Daniel didn't respond. I could hear traffic behind him. Finally, he said, "My mother wrote that and you knew about it." I knew she was concerned. Concerned about what? He hesitated. Then he said something that changed the way I saw him. "She's wanted to make sure you weren't going to bring financial responsibilities into our marriage." I stared at the wall. My father raised me alone. I know. He paid for my education. I know. He supported me when I joined the army. I know. He never asked me for a dime. I know, Claire. "Then what financial responsibility are you talking about?" Daniel's voice became quieter. "What if he needs help later?" There it was, the assumption. They had already decided that my father was going to become a burden. They had never asked him. They had never spoken to him. Honestly, they had simply judged him. I said, "You don't know my father. I've met him. You've met the version of him he showed you, because he was trying to make you feel welcome." Daniel didn't answer. I continued. "My father doesn't measure people by their income." "I don't either. I never said I did." "You didn't have to." The silence returned. Then Daniel said, "Claire, don't destroy our relationship over something my parents did." I felt my chest tighten. "That's the problem, Daniel. What you keep saying, your parents did it." He was quiet. "You were sitting beside me when they mocked him." I didn't know how to respond. "You laughed." I was uncomfortable. "You laughed. I made a mistake." "No. I looked at the property records again. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is saying the wrong thing at dinner. You made a choice. His voice cracked slightly. I love you. I believe you think you do. What's that supposed to mean? It means love isn't enough if respect isn't there. I ended the call. That night, I sat alone in my apartment. The wedding was only a few months away. Deposits had been paid. Invitations had gone out. Family members had already made travel arrangements. Ending everything would be painful, embarrassing, expensive, but none of those things scared me as much as marrying someone I could no longer trust. I looked at the ring on my finger. Then I remembered Dad's words. Don't choose or lose a man because you're afraid to start over. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to retaliate. And I wasn't going to let Daniel's family turn me into someone bitter. But before I walked away, I wanted the truth to come into the light. So, I decided to give them one final opportunity to tell me what they really wanted. And this time, I would make sure everyone was in the room. The invitation went out 3 days later. I didn't send it as a threat. I didn't mention the property records. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply told Daniel and his parents that my father wanted to host a small dinner before the wedding, and that it would be good for both families to clear the air. Daniel called me within 10 minutes. Are you sure this is a good idea? Yes. Claire, my parents feel terrible about what happened. Then they'll have an opportunity to explain themselves. He hesitated. Are you going to tell my parents you understand French? I smiled faintly. They already know. He sighed. I just don't want another argument. Neither do I. That was true. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wanted clarity. The dinner was held at a private country club about 30 minutes from Fort Liberty. It wasn't extravagant, but it was elegant enough that Daniel's parents seemed comfortable there. Dad had chosen the location because he wanted everyone to have a proper meal and a quiet conversation. He had no idea that I had already prepared for something much bigger. When Daniel arrived with his parents, he looked nervous. His mother kissed my cheek. Claire, darling, I hope we can put the unpleasantness behind us. I looked at her. I hope so too. Her smile lasted only a second. Then everyone sat down. Dad opened the conversation. I know the last dinner didn't end well. Lauren nodded. We regret this misunderstanding. I looked at him. A misunderstanding. He shifted in his chair. Yes, we spoke privately in French. We didn't realize Claire understood. I took a sip of water. That wasn't the misunderstanding. Nobody answered, I continued. The misunderstanding was believing that because I couldn't hear you in English, I couldn't hear you at all. Isabel looked down. Daniel rubbed his hands together. Claire, I think everyone understands what happened. I'm not sure they do. I placed a folder on the table. Daniel's eyes immediately went to it. His expression changed. His mother noticed. What is that evidence? I opened the folder. Inside were printed copies of messages, property records, and questions Daniel had sent me over the previous months. I didn't slam them onto the table. I simply arranged them one by one. Dad watched silently. Laurent leaned forward. Where did you get these? I found them. That is private correspondence. So was the conversation you had about my father. Nobody spoke. I looked at Daniel. Did you know your mother was asking whether I would inherit my father's house? Daniel swallowed. Yes. Dad's eyes moved toward him. You knew. Daniel looked at him. Mr. Morgan. Dad raised his hand. Don't call me Mr. Morgan. You've been in my house for 3 years. Daniel looked ashamed. Dad's voice remained calm. Call me Robert. Daniel nodded. Robert. I could see how uncomfortable he was. For the first time, he couldn't hide behind charm. I turned toward Isabel. You asked whether my father had a will. She didn't answer. You asked whether his house was paid off. Silence. You asked whether I was the beneficiary of his life insurance. Her face wrined. I was concerned about your future. No. I looked directly into her eyes. You were concerned about what my future might be worth. She stiffened. That is an unfair interpretation. Then tell me why you needed the property records. She looked at Laura. He finally spoke. We wanted to understand what financial obligations might come with the marriage. I almost smiled. Financial obligations? Yes. My father has never asked me for financial support, but someday he might. Dad finally spoke. I might. Everyone looked at him. He continued. I might need help someday. I'm 64, not immortal. There was no anger in his voice. just honesty. But if that day comes, my daughter will help me because she loves me, not because she married into your family. Laurent said, nothing. Dad looked at Daniel. And if my daughter marries you, I hope you'll help her because you love her. That's what families are supposed to do. Daniel's eyes dropped. I felt tears beginning to burn behind my eyes. Dad wasn't defending himself. He was teaching them. Then Laurent made the mistake that changed everything. He said with respect, Robert, love does not pay bills. Dad nodded. No, but neither does arrogance. The room became silent. I almost smiled. That was my father. Quiet for an hour. Then one sentence that ended the argument. I turned toward Daniel. You said your parents were only protecting our future. Yes. Then why did you let them investigate my father? I was trying to keep everyone happy. I shook my head. That isn't an answer. I didn't want conflict. You wanted comfort. He looked at me. And you were willing to let my father become the price of that comfort. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. That's not what I wanted. But that's what happened. His mother suddenly spoke. We never intended to hurt anyone. I looked at her. Intent doesn't erase impact. She looked away. I opened the final page. It was a message from Isabel to Daniel. You need to know what Claire will actually inherit before you make any permanent commitments. Dad read it. His face became completely still. Then he looked at me. Claire, I know. He looked at Daniel. Is this why you proposed? Daniel immediately shook his head. No. Dad's voice remained calm. Then, why was my inheritance part of your decision? Daniel couldn't answer. That silence was answer enough. I reached down and removed my engagement ring. I placed it on the table. Daniel stared at it. Claire, please. I shook my head. I wanted to believe that you were different. I am. You had 3 years to prove it. He stood. I love you, I know. Then don't do this. I looked at him. Love isn't supposed to make me question whether the person beside me respects the people I love. His mother began crying. His father looked furious. Not at me, at Daniel. Suddenly the family began arguing among themselves. Daniel blamed his parents. His parents blamed his concerns about our finances. Voices rose. Everyone started defending themselves. I sat quietly, and strangely I felt peaceful. For months I had wondered whether I was imagining the warning signs. Now I didn't have to wonder anymore. I stood. I'm not going to insult anyone. Everyone became quiet. I don't want revenge. I looked at Daniel. I want the truth. Then I looked at his parents. You came to America believing my father was a poor man standing between you and your son's future. I paused. You were wrong. Laurent frowned. What do you mean? I looked at Dad. He gave me a small nod. I turned back to them. My father has spent his entire life living below his means, saving carefully and helping people who needed him. I didn't give them a dollar figure. I didn't need to. My father isn't wealthy because of what he owns. I looked at Daniel. He's wealthy because of who he is. Nobody spoke. I picked up my purse. Then I walked toward the door. Behind me, Daniel said my name. I stopped, but I didn't turn around. Claire. His voice broke. Please don't leave. I closed my eyes. Then I answered quietly. I already did. I didn't cry until I got home. The moment I closed my apartment door, the composure I had maintained throughout the entire dinner disappeared. I leaned against the wall and covered my face with both hands. The wedding was over, not postponed, not reconsidered. Over. And strangely, the hardest part wasn't losing Daniel. It was grieving the future I had imagined. For months I had pictured that future so clearly. A small house, Sunday breakfasts, holidays with both families, maybe children someday. Daniel beside me when I returned from long days at the base. I had believed I was building a life. Now I understood I had been building it on assumptions. My phone began ringing. Daniel. I let it ring then again and again. Finally I answered. Claire. His voice sounded exhausted. I don't want to fight. Neither do I. Then please let me explain. You've had several chances. I know. He took a breath. My parents pressured me. I closed my eyes. I know. They kept telling me that marriage wasn't only about love. They were right about that. What? Marriage isn't only about love. It's about trust, respect, character, boundaries. He became quiet. I made a mistake. You made several. I know. Then tell me which one you're talking about. He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said I should have defended your father. That was one. I shouldn't have allowed my parents to look into his finances. That was another. I shouldn't have laughed when they insulted him. My throat tightened. That was the one I can't forget. I was nervous. You were comfortable enough to laugh. I wasn't thinking. I looked out the window. That's exactly what scares me, he whispered. I love you. I believe you. Then why isn't that enough? Because love without respect becomes a burden. There was silence. Then he said, "Can I see you?" I almost said no. But part of me knew I needed one final conversation. Tomorrow. We met at a small coffee shop near downtown Fayetteville. Daniel arrived early. He looked different. Not physically, just smaller somehow, less confident. He stood when I approached Hyber. Hi, we sat across from each other. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel said, I ended the conversation with my parents. I raised an eyebrow. What does that mean? I told them. They crossed a line and they said I was choosing you over my family. You are supposed to choose your spouse. I know. I looked down at my coffee. Do you? Yes. He rubbed his hands together. I've spent my entire life trying to make my parents proud. And you thought marrying me would make them proud. He looked at me. At first, yes. The honesty hurt, but then I fell in love with you. I nodded. And somewhere along the way, you confused their approval with your own judgment. He looked down. You're right. I didn't expect him to say it. For a moment, I felt the old affection return. Then I reminded myself why I was sitting there. Daniel, I need you to understand something. He looked up. This wasn't about money. I know. No, I don't think you do. I leaned forward. If my father had been wealthy, would that have made the insults acceptable? No. If he had owned 10 houses, would that have made him more deserving of respect? No. If he had been poor, would that have made him less deserving? Daniel swallowed. No. Then why did your family need to know what he owned? He had no answer. I nodded. That is why we're here. He looked at me for a long time. I was afraid of what? That I wouldn't be able to give you the life you deserved. I almost smiled. You never asked me what kind of life I wanted. He looked surprised. I wanted a peaceful life, a loyal husband, a home where my father could walk through the front door without feeling judged. His eyes filled with tears. I wanted that too, but you weren't willing to protect it. He looked away. I reached into my purse and placed the engagement ring on the table. I can't marry you. He stared at it. I understand. The word surprised me. No argument, no pleading, just acceptance. I stood. Daniel remained seated. Claire. I looked back. I really did love you. I loved you too. Maybe someday you'll understand why I had to leave. I already do. I nodded. Then I walked outside. The afternoon sun was bright. Cars passed. People carried shopping bags. A woman pushed a stroller across the street. The world had not stopped because my wedding had ended. That realization was strangely comforting. A week later, I went to Dad's house. He was sitting on the back porch with 2 glasses of iced tea. He handed one to me. Thought you might need this. I smiled. News travels fast. I'm your father. I've earned the right to know when my daughter's life falls apart. I laughed. Then I started crying. Dad didn't say anything. He simply put his arm around my shoulders. After a while, I said, I'm sorry. He frowned. For what? For letting this happen? He shook his head. You didn't let anything happen. I should have seen it maybe. I looked at him. He continued. But seeing it earlier wouldn't have changed who they were. That stayed with me. Dad took a sip of tea. You know what marriage is? I smiled. I'm guessing you're about to tell me. It's not 2 people promising never to hurt each other. I listened. It's 2 people promising to tell the truth when something hurts. I nodded. And when they make mistakes, they fix them. He paused. But some mistakes tell you something about a person's character. I looked at him like what happened with Daniel. Exactly. I rested my head against his shoulder. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm. Not happy, not yet, but calm, and that was enough. My military career continued. I returned to work, trained younger soldiers, handled responsibilities, and slowly rebuilt the rhythm of my life. I stopped checking whether Daniel had called. I stopped wondering what his parents thought. I stopped trying to understand people who had already shown me who they were. Then, about 6 weeks later, I received a message from Daniel. It was short. I moved out. I stared at the screen. A second message appeared. I'm not asking you to take me back. I just wanted you to know I'm finally making decisions for myself. I didn't respond immediately. Then another message arrived. Your father was right. I need to become the kind of man who protects the dignity of the person I love, even when nobody is watching. I read it twice. I still wasn't ready to forgive him completely. Forgiveness wasn't a switch. It was a process, and trust was even slower. But for the first time, I believed he might actually be learning. That night, I called Dad. Hey Dad, hey kiddo. Daniel moved out. There was a pause. Good for him. I laughed. You're not surprised. No. Why? Because sometimes losing something is the only way people realize what they were about to lose. I looked out the window. The sunset was fading over the neighborhood. I thought about the dinner, the French, the insults, the fork hitting the plate, the ring, the humiliation, and then I realized something. I had spent so much time thinking about whether I had lost a fiancé that I hadn't noticed what I had gained: clarity, boundaries, and a deeper understanding of what my father had been trying to teach me my entire life. Not everyone who says they love you knows how to love you properly. And sometimes walking away isn't revenge. Sometimes it's self-respect. 6 months after that dinner, I was sitting at my father's kitchen table on a quiet Sunday morning. The coffee was too strong. The toast was slightly burned, and Dad was pretending he hadn't burned it. You've always liked it that way, he said. I've always been too polite to tell you otherwise, he laughed. For the first time in months, the memory of that dinner no longer made my chest tighten. It had become a story, a difficult one, but a story. My army career had continued, and life had slowly returned to something resembling normal. I had stopped wearing my engagement ring. The wedding deposits had been dealt with. The invitations had been canceled. There were still awkward conversations with relatives. There were still people who asked what happened. I learned to answer simply. We discovered we wanted different things from marriage. That was enough. I didn't need to tell everyone about the French conversation. I didn't need to explain every message or every question. Some truths are powerful precisely because you don't have to shout them. Daniel and I hadn't spoken much during those 6 months. Then one Saturday afternoon, he asked if he could meet my father. Not me, my father. Dad looked at me when I told him. What do you think? I shrugged. I don't know. You don't have to decide today. I know. Dad nodded, then let him come. Daniel arrived the following Sunday. He looked nervous when he stepped onto the porch. Dad opened the door. Come in. Daniel swallowed. Thank you. I stayed in the kitchen while they sat in the living room. I could hear parts of the conversation, but I didn't listen closely. This was something they needed to do, without me standing between them. After about 40 minutes, Daniel came into the kitchen. His eyes were red. Dad followed behind him. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Daniel looked at me. I owe your father an apology. I nodded. He turned toward Dad. Robert, I'm sorry. Dad didn't immediately respond. Daniel continued. I treated your family like a financial calculation. I let my parents' expectations influence decisions that should have been mine. And when they disrespected you, I stayed silent. Dad looked at him. Why? Daniel took a breath. Because I was afraid of disappointing them. Dad nodded slowly. That is honest. Daniel looked surprised. Dad continued. But honesty isn't the same as courage. Daniel lowered his eyes. I know. Dad leaned back. You don't owe me a perfect apology. You owe yourself an honest answer. Daniel looked confused. To what? Who are you when your family expects one thing and your conscience tells you another? The room became quiet. Daniel looked at me, then back at Dad. I don't know yet. Dad nodded. That's the first honest answer you've given me. I felt something loosen inside me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe understanding. Daniel eventually left. After he was gone, Dad sat beside me. You still love him? I looked down. I don't know. Dad smiled. That's okay. Do you think I should give him another chance? That isn't my decision. You're my father. Exactly. I looked at him. If I tell you what to do, then 20 years from now, you'll blame me if it doesn't work. I laughed softly. Dad pointed toward me. You're 31. You're an army officer. You've made decisions that affected other people's lives. You can decide who gets your heart. I smiled. You make it sound easy. It isn't. He took another sip of coffee. That's why it's yours to decide. A few weeks later, Daniel and I met for lunch. There was no engagement ring, no wedding plans, no promises. Just two people trying to understand whether something broken could be rebuilt. He told me he had started counseling. He had also set boundaries with his parents. He was no longer allowing them access to his personal financial decisions. He had taken responsibility for his own mistakes. Most importantly, he wasn't asking me to forget. I know I hurt you, he said. Yes, I know I hurt your father. Yes, and I know saying sorry doesn't erase that. No, he nodded. Then I don't expect it to. That mattered because apologies without changed behavior are often just another way to ask someone to stop being angry. I told him that if there was ever going to be another relationship between us, it would have to be different. No secret financial discussions. Agreed. No family member gets to make decisions for us. Agreed. No assumptions about my father's money. Never again, and if your parents disrespect my father, Daniel looked directly at me. I speak up. I nodded even if they're angry, especially then. That was the first answer that made me believe he might have changed. We didn't get engaged again. We didn't rush anything. We started slowly. Coffee, walks, long conversations, sometimes difficult ones, sometimes silence, and eventually Daniel apologized to Dad again. This time Dad accepted it, not because he had forgotten, because Daniel had earned the right to be heard. One evening, months later, Dad and I were sitting on the porch. The sunset was turning the sky gold. He looked at me and said, "Remember the fork?" I laughed. "You're never going to let that go, are you?" "Absolutely not." I shook my head. "You know, I thought I was defending you that night." Dad smiled. "No." I looked at him. He said, "You were defending yourself." I frowned. "How?" "By deciding what kind of treatment you were willing to accept from the person you married." I thought about that. He was right. I hadn't stood up because Dad was weak. Dad wasn't weak. I stood up because disrespecting him meant disrespecting the values that had shaped me. And I finally understood something else. Revenge doesn't always look like destroying someone. Sometimes revenge is walking away with your dignity intact. Sometimes it's refusing to let another person's greed turn you bitter. Sometimes it's allowing the truth to expose itself without exaggeration. And sometimes the greatest victory is becoming wiser because someone else treated you badly. For anyone listening to my story, especially those of us who have lived long enough to know that family relationships can become complicated, I want to leave you with a few things I learned. First, pay attention to how people treat your parents when they think you aren't listening. Second, don't confuse wealth with character. A large house doesn't make someone generous. A modest home doesn't make someone less valuable. Third, financial conversations matter in marriage. You should talk openly about money, debt, retirement, inheritance, and responsibilities. But there is a difference between healthy financial planning and entitlement to someone else's assets. Fourth, never confuse forgiveness with forgetting. You can forgive someone and still maintain boundaries. You can accept an apology without immediately restoring trust. And finally, if you're preparing to marry someone, don't only ask yourself, "Do I love this person?" Ask something harder. Who will this person become when life gets difficult? Because that's when character appears. Daniel and I never returned to the relationship we had before that dinner. We built something different, slower, more honest, more careful. Whether that eventually became a marriage was less important to me than knowing that this time neither of us was pretending. And Dad, he still drives that old truck. He still burns the toast. He still tells embarrassing stories about me. And every time I visit, he reminds me that the most important things in life usually aren't the things we can put a price on. I used to think that night was about exposing Daniel's family. It wasn't. It was about seeing clearly. It was about learning that loyalty should never require you to abandon your values. It was about realizing that a peaceful life is worth more than an impressive wedding. And it was about remembering something my father had taught me long before I ever put on an army uniform. Never let someone else's poor character decide who you become. That sentence has stayed with me. So if this story reminded you of someone in your own life, take a moment to think about what it taught you. Maybe someone needs to hear that respect matters more than status. Maybe someone needs to hear that boundaries aren't cruelty. Or maybe someone simply needs the courage to walk away from a relationship that no longer feels honorable. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need that reminder. And if you enjoy stories about family, courage, dignity, and the quiet strength it takes to stand up for what is right, consider subscribing. Because sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought on a battlefield. They're fought quietly across a dinner table when you finally decide that your values are worth defending. The courtroom went silent when the judge looked over the financial statement and said, "Mr. Wickham, you appear to have misunderstood the financial position of your wife." My husband stopped smiling. Across the aisle, his attorney shifted in his chair. Behind them, my mother-in-law, Judith, whispered something I couldn't hear. Then she looked directly at me, and the color drained from her face. I kept my hands folded in my lap. The judge turned another page. "According to these records, your wife's net worth is approximately $28.7 million. Judith stood so quickly that her chair scraped the floor. $28 million. Then she collapsed. My husband stared at me as if I had become a stranger. But the strangest part was this. I had never wanted him to know about the money. Not because I was ashamed of it. Because 3 weeks earlier, I had still believed I was married to a man who loved me. And that was the day everything changed. 3 weeks before that courtroom, I sat in a quiet law office in Columbus, Ohio, listening to an attorney read my grandfather's will. My grandfather Arthur had been the kind of man who never talked about money. He wore the same brown wool coat for years, drove an old Buick, and complained if anyone spent $10 on coffee. To most people, he looked like a retired businessman living a modest life. I knew better. I just never knew how much better. My mother sat beside me. My 2 children, Eli and June, sat together near the window. My husband, Gideon, had taken the afternoon off work. The attorney, Evelyn Rusk, adjusted her glasses. "There are several personal bequests," she said. "But the principal beneficiary is Mara." I looked up. "Me?" Evelyn nodded. She continued reading. "At first, I didn't understand what I was hearing. There were investment accounts, commercial properties, shares in a private company, and a family trust established years earlier in my name. My grandfather had not simply left me money. He had left me control." I felt my throat tighten. "Why didn't he ever tell me?" I whispered. Evelyn gave me a small knowing smile. "Because Arthur believed that knowing too early could change the way people treated you." That sentence stayed with me, especially when Gideon leaned toward me and asked quietly how much I turned toward him. "I don't know yet." He studied my face. "You must have some idea." "I really don't." He leaned back. For the first time that afternoon, I noticed something different in his expression. Not happiness for me, calculation. I had never seen that look before. After the meeting, we drove home separately because Gideon had another appointment. The next morning, Gideon asked again, "So, what did Evelyn say?" "There's a trust." "What kind?" "I don't know yet. We're meeting again next week." He nodded slowly. Then he said something I should have remembered. "You're lucky." I smiled. "So are you. You're my husband." He didn't smile back. Instead, he said, "We'll need to talk about how we're going to handle everything." Everything. At the time, I thought he meant our future. I was wrong. A few days later, I made a decision that now seems almost painfully innocent. Gideon had a business trip to Chicago. The children and I decided to surprise him. June thought it would be hilarious to show up at his hotel with his favorite cheesecake. Eli wanted to see Chicago, and I wanted to see my husband's face when his family suddenly appeared at the hotel after a long week. We flew out on Friday afternoon. The plan was simple. We would check into a nearby hotel, wait until Gideon finished his meeting, then surprise him at dinner. But when we arrived at the hotel, I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. Gideon was standing near the restaurant entrance. He wasn't alone. A woman in a navy blazer stood beside him. She touched his arm. Eli bumped into my shoulder. "Mom," I put one hand up. "Stay here," the woman asked. "Are you sure she won't fight you?" Gideon smiled. "She doesn't have the money to fight me." My stomach dropped. The woman looked concerned. "And the inheritance?" Gideon glanced around before answering. "Once the divorce is filed, we'll find out exactly what she has." I stopped breathing for a second. Inheritance, divorce, find out what she has, all in the same conversation. Then Gideon said something that hurt more than anything else. "I've already spoken to a lawyer." I stood behind a column, listening to the man I had loved for 16 years discuss the end of our marriage, as if he were negotiating a business contract. I looked at my children and realized I had 2 choices. I could walk into that restaurant and confront him, or I could stay quiet long enough to understand exactly what he was planning. I chose silence, not weakness, not fear. Silence. I took my children back to the airport that evening. On the flight home, June slept against my shoulder. Eli stared out the window. Finally, he asked Mom, "Why didn't we surprise Dad?" I looked at my son because sometimes I said quietly, "You learn something important before you're ready to hear it." After the children were asleep, I called Evelyn. She answered on the second ring. "Mara, is everything all right?" "No," I said. Then I told her what I had heard. There was a long silence. Finally, Evelyn said, "Do not confront him yet." "Why?" "Because if Gideon is already planning around your inheritance, we need to know exactly what he has done." I closed my eyes. Then Evelyn said the words that made my blood run cold. "Mara, someone has already contacted my office asking questions about your grandfather's trust." "Who?" Another pause. "Your husband's attorney." I sat alone in the dark kitchen, staring at the refrigerator light. 3 weeks later, that same man would stand in a courtroom and laugh in my face. He thought I was broke. He thought I was frightened. He thought he was divorcing a woman with nothing. He had no idea what my grandfather had left me, and he had even less idea what I had just learned about him. The next morning, I sat across from Evelyn in her office while she spread several documents across the conference table. Outside the window downtown, Columbus moved through another ordinary workday. Cars stopped at red lights. People carried coffee into office buildings. Somewhere below us, a delivery truck was backing into an alley. Everything looked normal. My life no longer was. Evelyn folded her hands. "Before we talk about your inheritance, I need you to understand something." I nodded. "If Gideon is preparing for divorce, you should assume that anything you say about your grandfather's estate could become part of a legal strategy." I stared at the papers. "So, he knows there is something. That isn't the same as knowing how much." "No," Evelyn said, "and we should keep it that way." I had never thought of my marriage in terms of legal strategy. For 16 years, I had thought of Gideon as the person I called when our children were sick, when the furnace broke, when my mother needed help, or when I simply wanted to tell someone about my day. Now, Evelyn was telling me to protect myself from him. It was difficult to accept. "Is my inheritance actually mine?" I asked. "That depends on how the assets were structured. Your grandfather created the trust years ago. Some assets are clearly separate, but we need to document everything carefully." I nodded. Then she slid another folder toward me. "This is what concerns me." Inside was an email. It had been sent to a financial institution by someone representing Gideon. The message asked about the possibility of determining the value of assets held in a family trust during divorce proceedings. My hands and fingers became cold. "He's already investigating it." "Yes." I looked at the date. It had been sent 2 days before the will reading. 2 days. I looked up. How could he know Evelyn didn't answer immediately? That's what we need to find out. For the first time, I wondered whether the questions about my grandfather's estate had started before Arthur even died. I drove home without calling Gideon. He was already there when I arrived. He was sitting at the kitchen island with his laptop open, wearing the gray quarter-zip sweater I had bought him for Christmas. For a moment, the sight of him almost broke my resolve. This was the man I had kissed goodbye that morning, the man who had held my hand during my father's funeral, the man who had slept beside me for 16 years. He looked up. Hey, how was your day?" "Fine," he smiled. "Did you talk to the attorney?" My heart sank. "About what?" "The estate." There it was. I put my purse down. "Why are you so interested?" He closed his laptop. "Because we're married, Mara." That sentence would have comforted me once. Instead, it sounded like a warning. "I don't know much yet." He studied me. Should she tell you about the properties?" "No." "The trust," I said. "I don't know." He sighed. "You don't have to be secretive with me." I almost laughed, not because anything was funny, because he had no idea how strange that sentence sounded after what I had heard in Chicago. "I wasn't aware I was being secretive." He stood. "I'm just saying, whatever your grandfather left you, we need to make smart decisions." "Why?" "Because we're a family." I looked toward the hallway. Our children's backpacks were lying on the floor. Their shoes were scattered near the stairs. For years, I had believed that word family meant safety. That night, it sounded like leverage. "I'll let you know when I understand everything," I said. His jaw tightened. "Fine." He walked away. I stayed in the kitchen, until I heard the bedroom door close. That was the first night I locked important documents in a safe. It was also the first night I began looking carefully at the last few years of my marriage. I remembered things I had dismissed. Gideon asking whether my grandfather owned commercial property. Gideon's insisting that I sign refinancing documents without reading every page. Gideon becoming unusually interested in my financial accounts after Arthur became ill. At the time, I had called it curiosity. Now, I wondered if it had been preparation. The following Monday, I received divorce papers. They arrived at our house just after 9 in the morning. A process server stood on the porch. "Mrs. Whitcomb." "Yes, I have legal documents for you." My hands trembled as I accepted them. I closed the door. Then, I stood there for almost a full minute, staring at the envelope. Gideon hadn't even waited to talk to me. He had filed. The petition requested temporary control over several marital assets and claimed that my financial circumstances were uncertain. There was another phrase that caught my attention: potential undisclosed assets. I sat down at the dining room table. He was accusing me of hiding money while he had already been investigating my inheritance. I called Evelyn. "I got the papers." "I expected that. Can he take the trust?" Not simply because he filed for divorce. The relief lasted about 3 seconds, but she continued. "We need to prepare carefully." That afternoon, Gideon came home early. He placed a folder on the table. "You should sign these." I didn't touch it. "What are they?" "An agreement to simplify things." "Simplify what?" "The divorce." I looked at him. "You've already decided," he shrugged. "There's no point dragging this out." Then he smiled. It was the same smile I had seen in Chicago. Confident, almost amused. "You don't have the money to fight me, Mara." The room went quiet. Our son Eli was standing in the hallway. He had heard everything. Dad, Gideon turned. "What?" "Mom doesn't need money to be our mom." Gideon's expression hardened. "This is an adult conversation." Eli shook his head. "You're the one who said she doesn't make real money. Go upstairs." Eli didn't move. I stood and gently touched his shoulder. "It's okay. Go finish your homework." He looked at me, then at his father. "Okay." When he left, Gideon lowered his voice. "You're making this harder than it has to be." I looked down at the folder. "No." He waited. "You made this harder when you decided my value depended on what you thought I owned." His face changed. For the first time, I saw uncertainty, but it disappeared quickly. "You'll regret fighting me." "I don't want to fight you." I pushed the folder back across the table. "I just won't let you frighten me into signing something I don't understand." He left without another word. That evening, after the children went to bed, I sat alone in my grandfather's old study. Arthur had left me the room almost exactly as it had been. His books were still on the shelves. His old brass desk lamp still sat beside the chair. I opened the drawer and found a handwritten note with my name on it. The note was dated 6 months before his death. It contained only a few lines. "Mara, people may treat you differently when they discover what I have left you. Remember that their reaction is about them, not you. Protect what I entrusted to you, but never let money convince you that you are worth more than anyone else. Your character was always the inheritance I cared about most." I read those words twice. Then I cried, not because of the money, because my grandfather had understood something I hadn't. He knew that wealth could reveal people, and now my husband was revealing himself. The next morning I called Evelyn. "I want to know everything." She understood. "We'll start with the trust. And Gideon, we let him keep believing he knows what he's dealing with." I took a deep breath. For 16 years I had tried to keep peace in my marriage. Now, I wasn't trying to destroy Gideon. I was simply going to stop protecting him from the consequences of his own choices. And for the first time since the divorce papers arrived, I wasn't afraid of what would happen next. I was ready to find out. By Monday morning, that the house had become a place where every conversation felt like a negotiation. Gideon stopped asking about the inheritance directly. Instead, he asked questions that sounded ordinary. "Did you call the bank? Are you still meeting with Evelyn? Have you decided what you're doing with the property?" I answered as little as possible, not because I wanted to play games, because I had finally realized that information was no longer safe in our home. 2 days after receiving the divorce papers, I met Evelyn again. She had prepared a thick binder and placed it in front of me, This is everything we've confirmed so far. I opened it. The first section contained the trust documents. The second contained property records. The third contained investment accounts. The fourth contained correspondence related to the estate. I looked at her. How much is it worth? She paused. We're still verifying the final valuation. Give me an estimate. Evelyn turned a page, approximately $28 million, depending on the final appraisal and market conditions. I stared at her. 28 million. I had spent most of my life worrying about ordinary things: mortgage payments, grocery bills, car repairs, school expenses. I had never imagined that one day someone would tell me I was worth more than $28 million. But the number didn't make me feel rich. It made me feel exposed. What happens now? We protect the assets and document where they came from. And Gideon, he can request information through the divorce process. That doesn't mean he automatically receives the inheritance. I nodded. Then Evelyn leaned forward. Mara, I want to ask you something. What did Gideon ever pressure you to sign documents without explaining them? I thought about it. Yes. How often? Several times over the years. Do you remember what they were? Some refinancing papers, a couple of business-related forms, one document connected to a property. Evelyn's expression changed. Do you still have copies? I don't know. Find them. I went home that afternoon and started searching. For hours, I went through filing cabinets, old email accounts, tax folders, and boxes in the basement. Near midnight, I found a folder I had forgotten about. Inside were copies of several documents Gideon had asked me to sign 3 years earlier. One involved a commercial property. Another authorized financial access to an account I barely used. I photographed everything and sent it to Evelyn. Her response came 20 minutes later. Do not discuss these documents with Gideon. The next morning, she called. These may be important. How important? Potentially very. She explained that one document appeared to give Gideon broader access to information than I had understood at the time. He hadn't transferred ownership of my inheritance. He couldn't. But he had been trying to position himself to understand what I owned and what he might eventually claim. I sat at my kitchen table. Why would he do this before the divorce? Because preparation often starts before the other person knows there's a problem. I looked toward the hallway. The children were getting ready for school. For 16 years, I had thought Gideon and I were building something together. Maybe I had been building. Maybe he had been calculating. That afternoon, I received a text from him. We need to talk tonight, just the two of us. I almost ignored it. Instead, I agreed. He came home around 7. He sat across from me at the dining table. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said, I don't want this to become ugly. I almost smiled. You already filed for divorce. I know you hired a lawyer before you told me. I was protecting myself from what he looked at me from uncertainty. I knew what he meant, the inheritance. He wanted to know exactly what I had. You could have asked me? I did, and I told you I didn't know. He leaned back. Mara, let's be honest. Your grandfather was wealthy. You knew there was money. I knew he had assets. I didn't know what he was leaving me. He shook his head. You always do this. Do what? Pretend. You don't understand how things work. I felt something inside me settle. Not anger, something quieter. Clarity. You've already decided who I am in your mind. He didn't answer. Then he said, I think we should sell the house. No. His eyebrows rose. You don't get to decide that alone. I know. And I think you should sign the agreement my attorney prepared. No. He stared at me. You haven't even read it. I had my attorney review it. His expression hardened. You're really going to make this difficult. I am going to make it fair. He stood. You're going to regret this. I looked at him. I already regret something. What? Trusting you without asking enough questions. He walked out. That night, I heard the garage door close, then silence. I thought that was the end of our conversation. It wasn't. The next morning, Gideon served a request for financial disclosure. He wanted records of my inheritance trust documents, investment accounts, property valuations, and anything else connected to Arthur's estate. Evelyn wasn't surprised. Let him ask, she said. But what if he gets everything he gets what the law requires him to get? Nothing more. She explained that inherited assets could be treated differently from property accumulated jointly during a marriage, depending on state law and how the assets were handled. She also warned me that mixing inherited money with marital funds could complicate matters. That conversation taught me something I wished I had known years earlier. Financial literacy wasn't just about knowing how to save money. It was also about understanding what you owned, how it was titled, and what legal protections applied to it. Then Evelyn showed me something unexpected. A series of emails between Gideon and his attorney. In one of them, Gideon had written, "If the trust is as large as I think it is, we need to move quickly." I read the sentence twice. Then another message caught my attention. "She won't know what she's entitled to. We can negotiate from there." My hands tightened around the paper. He wasn't planning a divorce based on the failure of our marriage. He was planning a financial negotiation, and he believed I was too uninformed to understand the difference. I looked at Evelyn. "What do we do?" She closed the folder. "We let the evidence speak." I nodded. For the first time, I understood what my grandfather had meant about people changing when they discovered what you had. The money hadn't changed, Gideon. It had simply removed the disguise. That evening, I sat with Eli and June while they ate pizza at the kitchen table. June asked, "Is Dad still mad?" I took a breath. "Dad and I are having some adult problems. Are we going to be okay?" I reached across the table and held her hand. "Yes," Eli looked at me. "Even if you get divorced," I nodded. Even then, he seemed relieved. Then he asked the question I wasn't prepared for. "Mom, did Dad leave because of the money?" I looked at my children. I didn't want them to grow up believing money was the reason families stayed together. "No," I said gently. "Your father made his choices. The money only showed us what those choices meant." That night, after the children went to bed, I opened my grandfather's letter again. "Protect what I entrusted to you." I finally understood. He wasn't telling me to protect the money. He was telling me to protect myself, and I was ready. The first formal settlement conference was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at a law office in downtown Columbus. I arrived 15 minutes early. Gideon was already there. He sat beside his attorney with one ankle resting on his knee, looking relaxed. When I walked in, he glanced at me and smiled, not warmly, almost triumphantly. I sat beside Evelyn. The conference room was small and ordinary. There was a long wooden table, a coffee machine in the corner, and a framed photograph of the Columbus skyline on the wall. Nothing about the room looked dramatic, but I knew my marriage was being dismantled inside it. Gideon's attorney began. "We're hoping to resolve this efficiently." Evelyn nodded. "So are we." Gideon looked at me. "Mara, there's no reason this has to become hostile." I almost laughed. He had filed for divorce without telling me. He had already contacted attorneys about my grandfather's trust, and now he wanted to talk about hostility. I kept my voice calm. "I agree. It doesn't have to become hostile." He smiled. "Good, but it does have to be honest." His smile disappeared. Evelyn opened a folder. "We have several issues to address." She began with the house, then the vehicles, then the retirement accounts, then the children's expenses. Everything was ordinary until she reached the inheritance. Gideon's attorney leaned forward. "Mr. Whittam believes the inheritance should be considered when determining the overall division of marital assets." Evelyn answered calmly. "We understand his position." Gideon looked at me. "You see, I'm not asking for anything unreasonable." I said nothing. His attorney continued. "We also believe the trust requires further examination." Evelyn slid a document across the table. "The trust has already been reviewed. We want additional records. You'll receive what you're legally entitled to receive." Giddy sighed. "Mara, why are you making this so difficult?" I looked directly at him. "You keep saying that because it's true." "No. What's difficult is that you keep asking for things you already know you can't have." His attorney interrupted. "Let's keep this productive." Evelyn nodded. "I agree." Then she placed another folder on the table. "This concerns Mr. Whittam's financial disclosures." Gideon looked confused. "What about them?" Evelyn opened the folder. "In your initial filing, you stated that your wife's financial position was uncertain, and that she appeared to have concealed assets." Gideon nodded. "Correct. Yet, your correspondence with your attorney indicates that you had already been investigating the family trust before the divorce petition was filed." His face changed just slightly, but I saw it. His attorney looked at him. "Gideon said I was trying to understand the situation." Evelyn nodded. "That's reasonable. She turned another page. But then why did you state that you had no knowledge of the inheritance? Gideon froze. I hadn't known Evelyn had this email. She had obtained it through the proper legal process. The room became very quiet. His attorney whispered something to him. Gideon leaned toward the table. I didn't know the exact amount. You knew about the trust. I suspected. You contacted a financial institution about accessing it. I was asking questions. Evelyn didn't raise her voice. That is exactly what the records show. Gideon looked at me. This isn't what you think. I stared at him. I haven't said what I think. He looked away. Then Evelyn opened another file. This is more concerning. She showed the room copies of the documents Gideon had once asked me to sign. The refinancing papers, the property authorization, the account access forms. Gideon's attorney examined them. Evelyn explained that while none of those documents transferred ownership of my inheritance, they demonstrated a pattern of financial preparation that contradicted the picture Gideon had presented. His attorney frowned. Why wasn't this disclosed? Gideon answered quickly. I didn't think it was relevant. Evelyn looked at him. It became relevant when you alleged that Mara had hidden assets. I felt strangely calm. Months earlier, I would have wanted to scream. Instead, I simply watched. Gideon's confidence was disappearing one document at a time. Then Evelyn pulled out a printed email. This one is dated before the will reading. Gideon's attorney reached for it. Evelyn read aloud. If the trust is as large as I think it is, we need to move quickly. Gideon closed his eyes. I looked at him. He didn't look back. The attorney asked, Mr. Whittam, did you write this? Gideon hesitated. Yes, who are you referring to? He didn't answer. Evelyn did, my client. The room fell silent. I remembered sitting in the lawyer's office when my grandfather's will had been read. I remembered Gideon asking how much I remembered, thinking he was simply curious. Now I understood he had already been measuring my value. Then something happened that hurt more than any financial document. Evelyn produced another email. This one was from Judith, Gideon's mother. I stared at the screen. The message was short. If Arthur left her the properties, don't let her walk away with everything. Gideon has a right to his share. I read it twice. My chest tightened. Judith had never asked me how I was handling my grandfather's death. She had never asked whether I was grieving. She had asked about property. That was the moment I stopped hoping for an explanation. There wasn't one. Gideon finally spoke. My mother was upset. She didn't understand the situation. I looked at him. She understood enough to discuss what I owned. He had nothing to say. The conference continued for another hour. By the end, nothing was settled. But something had changed. The power in the room had shifted. Gideon could no longer pretend he was the victim of a financially secretive wife. He had created a paper trail, and that paper trail was now speaking for itself. Outside the building, I stood on the sidewalk while cold November wind moved through downtown. Gideon came out behind me. Mara. I turned. He walked toward me. Can we talk? We've been talking for weeks. Not like this. I waited. He lowered his voice. My mother shouldn't have sent that email. No, she was worried about you. He hesitated about our family. I looked at him. You mean about your financial future? He didn't answer. Then he said something I never expected. You don't understand what this money is going to do. I almost smiled. I understand exactly what it's doing, what it's showing me who people are. His face tightened. You think you're better than me now? No. I shook my head. I think I'm finally seeing you clearly. He looked down for a second. I saw the man I had married. Tired, scared, human. I almost felt sorry for him. Then I remembered his words in Chicago. She doesn't have the money to fight me. And whatever sympathy I had disappeared. I didn't want revenge. I wanted truth. And I knew the truth would eventually reach the courtroom. The final hearing was scheduled for the following week. That night, Evelyn called me. We're ready. I sat at the kitchen table. For what? To present the full financial record. I knew what she meant, the valuations. How much? She paused. The final number is 28.7 million. I closed my eyes. 28.7 million. For years, I had thought wealth was something that made people powerful. Arthur had taught me differently. Money could buy options. It could buy lawyers. It could buy time. But it couldn't buy character. And Gideon was about to learn that lesson in front of a judge. The morning of the final hearing, I woke before my alarm. For several minutes, I simply lay in bed and listened to the house. The refrigerator hummed downstairs. A car passed outside. Somewhere in the hallway, June's bedroom door creaked as the heat came on. It was an ordinary morning. But by the end of the day, nothing about our family would feel ordinary again. I got dressed in a navy suit and stood in front of the mirror. I looked tired. Not weak, just tired. 16 years of marriage had taught me that there were some battles you couldn't win by being louder. Sometimes you won by staying calm long enough for the truth to become impossible to ignore. At the courthouse, Evelyn met me near the entrance. "You ready?" I took a breath. "As ready as I'll ever be," she smiled. "Then remember what we discussed. Don't react to Gideon. Let the evidence speak." Inside the courtroom, Gideon was already seated beside his attorney. He looked confident, almost cheerful. When he saw me, he smiled. That same smile, the one that had once made me feel safe. Now, it only reminded me of the night he told another woman that I didn't have enough money to fight him. He leaned toward his attorney and whispered something. His attorney nodded. Behind them sat Judith. She wore a cream-colored suit and carried herself with the same confidence she had shown during our settlement conference. She caught my eye for a moment. She looked away. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The hearing began. At first, it was exactly what I expected. The attorneys discussed the house retirement accounts, vehicles, household expenses, and arrangements for the children. Then Gideon's attorney raised the issue of my inheritance. "Your Honor, there remain questions regarding the extent and nature of Mrs. Wickham's inherited assets." The judge looked toward Evelyn. "Miss Rusk." Evelyn stood. "We have provided the requested documentation." She handed several folders to the clerk. The judge reviewed them. "These include the trust documents." "Yes, Your Honor." "Estate records?" "Yes." "Property records and valuations?" "Yes." The judge continued reading. Gideon sat forward. His confidence seemed to return. He glanced at me. I kept my eyes on the judge. After several minutes, the judge looked at Gideon's attorney. "Mr. Wickham's filing characterized his wife's financial position as uncertain." "That is correct, Your Honor." The judge turned another page. "Yet these records appear rather specific." Gideon's attorney hesitated. "We believe there are questions regarding whether certain assets should be considered in the division of marital property." The judge nodded. "That is a separate question from whether the assets exist." "Yes, Your Honor." Evelyn stood. "May I clarify one point?" The judge nodded. "These assets do exist, but the majority were inherited through a trust established by Mrs. Wickham's grandfather and were not acquired through the marital partnership." She explained the structure carefully. Nothing dramatic, no shouting, no accusations, just documents. That was the strange thing about truth. It didn't need to raise its voice. The judge continued examining the records. Then he looked directly at Gideon. "Mr. Wickham, did you have knowledge of this trust before filing for divorce?" Gideon shifted in his chair. "I knew there might be an inheritance." "Did you investigate the trust before filing?" "I asked questions through counsel." "Yes." The judge nodded. "Then your filing's characterization of your wife's financial position as uncertain is somewhat misleading." Gideon swallowed. His attorney leaned over and whispered something. The judge wasn't finished. He picked up another document. "I'm also seeing correspondence suggesting you believed the trust could be substantial." Gideon said nothing. The judge looked toward Evelyn. "Is there a verified valuation?" "Yes, Your Honor." Evelyn handed over the final appraisal and financial summary. The judge read it silently. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then he looked up. "Mrs. Wickham." I straightened. "Yes, Your Honor." "Are these records accurate to the best of your knowledge?" "Yes." "Have you knowingly concealed any of these assets from the court?" "No." The judge nodded. Then he turned toward Gideon. "Mr. Wickham, the evidence before this court indicates that your wife has substantial inherited assets." Gideon remained silent. The judge continued. "The verified records place her current net worth at approximately $28.7 million. The room went completely still. I heard someone inhale sharply behind me. Gideon's face changed. The confidence disappeared. $28.7 million. He had known there was money, but he hadn't known the number. Neither had I until Evelyn confirmed it. Gideon stared at me, not with anger, not even disbelief, with something much harder to describe. Regret. His mouth opened. "You never told me." I looked at him. You never asked because you wanted to know what you could take. His attorney touched his arm. Don't. But Gideon wasn't listening. You knew I learned the final valuation last week. You knew this whole time. No. He shook his head. Then he looked toward the judge. So she gets all of it. The judge answered carefully, that's not what I said. Gideon blinked. The judge explained that the existence of substantial inherited assets did not automatically mean those assets were marital property, subject to division. Their treatment depended on how they were inherited, titled, maintained, and applicable state law. I watched Gideon's shoulders drop. He had imagined 28.7 million. He had imagined a future. He had imagined what he could claim, but the law didn't care about what he had imagined. It cared about documentation. Then I heard a sharp sound behind us. Judith had stood up. 28 million. Her face had gone pale. She took one step backward. Mom, Gideon said. She shook her head. This can't be right. Mom, sit down. She reached for the back of a chair. Her knees buckled. Someone called for assistance. Judith collapsed into the chair, unconscious for several seconds. The courtroom immediately shifted into confusion. The judge called for a brief recess. As people moved around her, I stood completely still. I didn't feel victorious. I felt sad. This wasn't how I had wanted any of this to happen. When Judith finally opened her eyes, she looked directly at me. There was no anger in her face anymore, only shock and perhaps shame. Gideon approached me during the recess. Mara, I turned. He looked older than he had that morning. I didn't know. I know. If I'd known, I stopped him. That is exactly the problem. He looked confused. What do you mean you loved the life you thought I could provide? You didn't love the person standing beside you. He lowered his eyes. I continued quietly. You filed for divorce because you thought I was worth less than you. Now that you know I'm worth more, you want to know if there's a way back. He didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. The judge eventually returned. The proceedings continued. The financial claims were addressed according to the evidence and applicable law. Gideon's attempt to characterize my inheritance as something he could simply claim was rejected. And when the final orders were discussed, I realized something. I had spent weeks afraid of losing everything, but I had never stopped to ask what everything actually meant. It wasn't the trust. It wasn't the properties. It wasn't $28, 7 million. It was my children, my dignity, my peace, and the ability to wake up every morning without wondering whether someone beside me was measuring my worth in dollars. When the hearing ended, Gideon stood near the courthouse doors. For the first time since I had known him, he didn't know what to say. Neither did I, so I walked past him. Not because I hated him, because I was finally ready to walk toward a life he could no longer control. 3 months after the hearing, my life was quieter. Not perfect, not magically healed, just quieter. The divorce had been finalized. The house was no longer filled with whispered arguments or tense silences. Gideon had moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, and we had established a parenting schedule that allowed Eli and June to spend time with both of us. At first, the children struggled. June asked whether we would ever have Thanksgiving together again. Eli stopped asking questions altogether. I learned that children don't always need every detail. They need consistency. They need to know that the adults in their lives can still be trusted to show up. So I showed up. Every school pickup, every parent-teacher conference, every soccer game, every night June wanted me to check under her bed. And whenever Gideon came to pick them up, I kept my voice calm. Have a good weekend, you too. There was no affection between us anymore, but there was respect eventually. One Saturday morning, Gideon arrived early. The children were still upstairs getting ready. He stood on the porch with his hands in his coat pockets. Can I talk to you? I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. What is it? He looked down the street. I've been going to counseling. I nodded. That's good. I know you don't owe me anything. I waited. He swallowed. I've been thinking about what you said in court. I knew exactly what he meant. You told me I lost you because I thought you were worthless when I believed you were poor. He looked at me. I deserved that. I didn't answer. He continued. I spent years thinking being the one who earned more money made me more important. His voice was quieter now. I didn't realize how much you were carrying. I looked through the window. June was running down the stairs. Eli was behind her, carrying a backpack. I turned back to Gideon. I'm glad you're seeing it now. I wish I had seen it sooner. He looked away. Do you ever think we could? He stopped. I knew what he was going to ask. Gideon. I know. He nodded. I know. There was no argument, no pleading. That was one of the first signs that perhaps he really was changing. I don't want you to hate me, he said. I don't hate you. Why not? Because I don't want to spend the rest of my life carrying you around in my head. He gave a small, sad smile. I understand. I believed him. Not completely, but enough. Later that afternoon, I visited Judith. I hadn't planned to, but she had called me several times and eventually I agreed to meet. She looked smaller than I remembered. The woman who had once walked into my house as though she owned it now sat quietly at her kitchen table. She poured me coffee. I owe you an apology. I nodded. Yes, you do. She looked down at her hands. When I heard about the inheritance, I thought about what it could do for Gideon. I know. I thought about security, about the future. You thought about money. She nodded. I did. Then she looked at me. I didn't think about you. That sentence mattered more than I expected. I took a sip of coffee. My grandfather always said money reveals character. Judith gave a sad laugh. I suppose it revealed mine. It revealed everyone's. She nodded. I was wrong about you. You were. I treated you like you weren't good enough for my son. I looked at her. I know. She wiped her eyes. I am sorry. I believed she meant it. Forgiveness didn't mean I suddenly trusted her. It didn't mean we became close. It simply meant I didn't need to punish her forever for something she had finally admitted. Before I left, Judith asked me something. What are you going to do with all that money? I smiled. Something my grandfather would approve of. I had already decided. I would keep enough to protect my children's future and maintain the properties responsibly. But I also wanted the inheritance to mean something beyond my own bank account. With the help of financial advisors and attorneys, I established an education fund for Eli in June. I also created a small family foundation supporting financial literacy programs in local communities. Not glamorous, not flashy, but useful. I remembered how little I had understood about trusts, inherited assets, property ownership, and financial planning before Arthur's death. I had assumed those were things wealthy people worried about. I learned that ordinary families need to understand them too. A will tells people what you want done with your estate. A trust can provide additional control and protection depending on how it is created. And when a person receives a significant inheritance, the smartest first step isn't buying a new house or announcing it to everyone they know. It is getting qualified legal and financial advice. I learned that the hard way. I also learned something about marriage. Love does not mean surrendering financial awareness. Trust does not mean signing documents you don't understand. And being a stay-at-home parent does not mean your contribution has no value. For years, I had allowed Gideon's income to become the measure of my importance. That was my mistake. His mistake was believing it too. One evening, months after the divorce, I sat on the back porch with Eli in June. The sun was setting behind the trees. June leaned against my shoulder. Mom, yes. Are you happier now? I looked at her. The honest answer surprised me. Yes, she smiled. Good. Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think Dad is happier, too. I looked at him. Why? He doesn't act angry anymore, I smiled. Sometimes people have to lose something before they understand what they had. Eli nodded. Then June asked, Do we still have to call him Dad? I laughed. Yes, sweetheart. He's still your dad. She giggled. For the first time in months, all three of us laughed together. And sitting there, I finally understood what my grandfather had meant in his letter. The real inheritance wasn't $28.7 million. It was the lesson. Know your worth before someone else tries to define it. Protect what has been entrusted to you. Learn enough about money that you cannot be easily manipulated, and never confuse wealth with character. Gideon thought he was leaving a poor woman. He discovered he was leaving a wealthy one. But that wasn't the real twist. The real twist was that, by the time the judge revealed my net worth, I had already discovered something worth far more. My own worth. The money changed my circumstances. The truth changed me. And today, when I think about that courtroom and the moment Judith collapsed, I don't feel victorious. I feel grateful that the truth came out before I spent another decade trying to prove my value to people who had already decided what I was worth. If this story reminded you of something you've experienced in your own life, take a moment to think about what your own inheritance really is. Maybe it isn't money. Maybe it's wisdom from a parent, lessons from a difficult marriage, the courage to start over, or simply the knowledge that you deserve to be treated with dignity. And if you've ever had someone underestimate you, I'd love for you to share your story in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what another person needs to hear today. If this story touched you, consider subscribing for more stories about family resilience, justice, and the quiet strength it takes to begin again. Because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't watching someone lose. You don't remember me, do you? The judge's question stopped the courtroom cold. I stood at the defense table without a lawyer, my father's house hanging in the balance, while my uncle's attorney sat across from me with the confident smile of a man who already knew how the story would end. Then the judge looked at me again. "You were in uniform that night." My throat tightened. I had no idea what she meant. And then she said the name of the town where I had been stationed years earlier. That was when my hand started shaking because I realized she wasn't asking a casual question. She remembered me, but I didn't remember her. 3 months earlier, I had thought the hardest thing I would ever do was bury my father. I was wrong. My father, Daniel Morgan, had died quietly in his sleep after a long battle with heart disease. He was 64, stubborn private, and the kind of man who fixed things himself, even when a professional could have done it faster. He had one prized possession that had never been about money. The small 2-story house where he and my mother had raised me. It sat on a tree-lined street in a quiet Ohio suburb. The paint was old. The kitchen cabinets were from the 1990s. The basement smelled faintly of sawdust because Dad had spent half his life repairing furniture down there, but it was home. My mother had died 6 years earlier. After that, Dad kept the house exactly as it was. Her blue coffee mug stayed on the second shelf. Her framed recipe cards remained beside the refrigerator. When I was deployed, he would send me photographs of that house whenever I was having a difficult week. "Come home," he always wrote. "I'll leave the porch light on." His will was simple. The house would go to me. Everything else was divided fairly among the family. My uncle Richard, Dad's younger brother, received some investments and personal property. He was not happy about the house. At first, I thought his anger was just grief. Then the letters started. Richard claimed my father had promised him the property years ago. He said he had paid for repairs. He said Dad had depended on him, and then through his attorney, he made a formal claim against the estate. The first time I read the complaint, I honestly thought there had been a mistake. My father had never told me Richard owned any part of the house. I called several attorneys. The first wanted a retainer I simply could not afford. The second was already booked for months. A third reviewed the basic paperwork and told me the case involved probate and property issues that could become expensive very quickly. I had savings, but most of it was tied up in my transition out of the military and my plans to repair the house. I kept searching. The court date came faster than I expected, so I walked into court alone. That morning, I wore a dark navy suit instead of my uniform. I tied my hair back and carried a folder containing every document I had managed to collect. Across the courtroom, Richard sat beside his attorney. His attorney looked polished, calm, and completely prepared. Richard looked at me and smiled. Not a warm smile, the kind of smile that said he believed I had already lost. When the hearing began, his attorney spoke first. He argued that Richard had contributed substantial money toward the property over the years, and that my father had intended to transfer the house to him. Then he produced a document, a supposed agreement signed by my father. I stared at the page. My father's name was at the bottom. For a moment I couldn't breathe. The signature looked right, almost too right. Richard's attorney turned toward me. "Miss Morgan, do you have counsel representing you today?" "No." He nodded slowly. "I see." There was something about those 2 words that made my face burn. The judge looked at me. "Miss Morgan, you understand that you are representing yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor." My voice sounded smaller than I wanted. The judge reviewed the document. Then she looked up. Do you have evidence that contradicts this agreement? I opened my folder. I had bank statements, property tax records, copies of my father's will, emails, notes. But suddenly, sitting beneath the weight of that courtroom, everything looked inadequate. Richard's attorney had professional exhibits, legal arguments, and years of experience. I had a folder and a grieving heart. I looked across at my uncle. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked relieved. Then the judge stared at me for several seconds. Her expression changed. Miss Morgan, I looked up. You don't remember me, do you? The room seemed to disappear. I shook my head. No, Your Honor. I'm sorry, I don't. She leaned back slightly. You were in uniform that night. My pulse began pounding. What night? She named a town, then a high, then a storm. I knew the place. I knew the night, but I still didn't know her. The judge glanced down at the file, then back at me. I need to make a disclosure before we continue. Richard's attorney immediately sat straighter. The judge explained that she had encountered me years earlier under circumstances unrelated to the current case. She said she could not allow that prior connection to affect the proceeding. Then she made a decision I never expected. She recused herself. Richard's confident expression disappeared. The judge stood. Before leaving the bench, she looked directly at me. There is something in this record that deserves a closer look. Then she was gone. I stood there frozen. I had entered that courtroom, believing I was about to lose my father's house. I left the courtroom with no victory, no lawyer, and no idea why a judge from years ago remembered me. But for the first time since Richard filed that lawsuit, I had the strange feeling that I wasn't walking toward the end of my father's story. I was walking toward the beginning of a truth he had never had the chance to tell me. The town the judge had named was Dayton, Ohio. The highway was Route 35, and the storm had happened 7 years earlier, during one of the worst nights of rain I could remember. Back then, I was still in the Army. I had been driving home from a training assignment when the rain became so heavy that headlights looked like blurred stars. Traffic slowed to almost nothing. Water ran across the highway, and thunder shook the windows of my car. Then I saw the wreck. A sedan had spun across 2 lanes and struck the concrete barrier. Its front end was crushed. Another vehicle had stopped behind it. Hazard lights flashing. I pulled over. I remember grabbing my phone, calling 911, and running through the rain. There was a woman inside the sedan. She was conscious but trapped. Please, she kept saying. Please don't leave me. I'm not leaving, I told her. I crawled close enough to reach her hand through the broken window. She was terrified. I remember talking to her about ordinary things because I knew panic could make a bad situation worse. I asked her where she lived. She told me. I asked if she had children. She said yes. I told her to keep breathing. Eventually, emergency crews arrived. Firefighters cut through the door, paramedics stabilized her, and police began controlling traffic. Before they took her away, she looked at me. What's your name, Claire? Claire? What? I smiled. Just Claire? She laughed weakly. Then the ambulance doors closed. I never saw her again. At least I thought I never did. Now, sitting in my car outside the courthouse 7 years later, I remembered her face. And suddenly, I remembered the judge. She had not been a judge that night. She had been the woman trapped in the car. Her name was Evelyn Carter. After the hearing, I sat in the parking lot for nearly 20 minutes staring at the steering wheel. My phone buzzed. It was my uncle. Hope you enjoyed your little courtroom performance. I didn't answer. Another message appeared. You should settle while you still can. I turned the phone face down. For the first time, I understood something important. Richard wasn't worried about losing. He was worried about what might happen if I kept looking. The case was reassigned to another judge. Several days later, Richard's attorney sent another letter demanding that I agree to a settlement. The offer was insulting. He wanted me to give up the house in exchange for a small payment and a promise that neither side would pursue further claims. I read it twice. Then I remembered my father's handwriting. Come home. I'll leave the porch light on. I wrote back that I would not agree. The next morning, I began doing what I had learned to do in the military whenever a situation became confusing. I made a timeline. I wrote down every date I could verify. My father bought the house in 1998. My mother died in 2020. Dad updated his will in 2021. Richard claimed he had paid for major repairs beginning in 2019. But the bank records I had showed something different. Dad had paid the contractors himself. I spread the documents across the dining room table. Receipts, bank statements, property tax bills, insurance records, emails. Then I found something that made me stop. Richard claimed he had paid for a new roof in 2019. But one of the checks had been written from my father's account. I checked another and another. Nearly every expense Richard claimed as his own had actually been paid by Dad. I leaned back in my chair. Why would you lie about this? The house was silent, then I noticed something else. The disputed agreement Richard's attorney had presented in court was dated March 14th, 2021. I knew that date. My father had been in the hospital that week. He had suffered a cardiac episode and spent 4 days there. I pulled out his medical records. March 14th. Hospitalized, not at home, not signing property agreements, not meeting with Richard. I stared at the date again. My hands went cold. I called the attorney who had previously told me he couldn't take my case. He agreed to speak with me for a few minutes. When I explained what I had found, his tone changed. Do you have the original document? No, only a copy. Then get the original if you can, and don't accuse anyone of forgery yet. Why? Because if you're right, the evidence will speak for itself. That sentence stayed with me. The next day, I contacted a local legal aid organization and explained my situation. They couldn't take over the entire case, but an attorney agreed to review some of the documents and explain what I should be looking for. She studied the disputed agreement, then she pointed to the signature. Your father normally signed his name like this? Yes. She compared it with older documents. It's similar. My heart sank, but she continued. Similar isn't the same as authentic. She pointed to the date. Your father's medical records may matter a lot here. I nodded. Then she asked, who witnessed this? I looked at the document. A name was listed, Margaret Lewis. I knew that name too. Margaret had worked for Richard's company years ago. The attorney looked at me. Find her. That night, I searched through old emails and public records. I found an address. I wasn't sure what I would discover when I knocked on that door, but I knew one thing. My father had spent his final years believing he had protected his home for me. I was going to find out exactly what Richard was trying to take from me, and why he was so confident that I would never uncover the truth. Margaret Lewis lived in a small ranch house about 20 minutes outside Columbus. I sat in my car across the street for almost 5 minutes before I finally worked up the courage to knock. I wasn't afraid of Margaret. I was afraid of what she might say. If she confirmed that the document was real, I could lose my father's house. If she said it was false, I would have to prove it. Either way, the truth was going to hurt. I knocked. A woman in her late 60s opened the door. Her gray hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, and she wore a sweatshirt and reading glasses. Can I help you? Are you Margaret Lewis? Her expression changed. Yes, my name is Claire Morgan. I'm Daniel Morgan's daughter. She stared at me. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she opened the door a little wider. Come in. Her living room was modest and comfortable. Family photographs covered one wall. She offered me coffee, but I declined. I placed a copy of the disputed agreement on the table. Margaret didn't touch it. Instead, she looked at me. Where did you get this? My uncle's attorney submitted it in court. Her face went pale. I was afraid of that. My heart began pounding. You recognize it? She nodded slowly. I recognize my name. I waited. She took off her glasses. Claire, I never witnessed your father signing this document. The room seemed to tilt. Then why is your name on it? I don't know. You signed something? Yes. What? A document Richard brought to me at work. He told me it was related to some business paperwork. I didn't read every page. My voice became quieter. Was my father there? No. Did you see him sign anything? No. I stared at the document. Then why would you sign as a witness? Margaret looked down at her hands. Because I trusted Richard. That sentence sounded painfully familiar. I thought about my father. He had trusted his brother, too. Margaret told me that she had left Richard's company a few months later. She had no idea the document would ever be used in a property dispute. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. Richard asked me not to talk about it. Why? He said it would only create problems. I looked at her. Problems for who? She didn't answer. I took a breath. Margaret, my father, was in the hospital on the date shown on this document. Her eyes widened. Then it couldn't have happened the way this says. That's what I believe. She leaned back. I have something. She stood and walked into a hallway. A few minutes later, she returned with an old cardboard box. Inside were notebooks, tax documents, photographs, and several envelopes. She searched through them carefully. Then she pulled out a small black notebook. I used to write down everything related to work, dates, meetings, appointments. She opened it. Her finger stopped on a page. March 14th, 2021. I leaned forward. What does it say? She turned the notebooks toward me. Written in blue ink were the words office closed early. Richard left around 3 and grow. No meeting with Daniel. I stared at the page. That was the same day. Yes, I felt tears burn behind my eyes. For the first time, I had something more than suspicion. I had a witness. I asked if she would be willing to speak with my attorney. Margaret hesitated. Then she nodded. Yes. Before I left, she looked at me. I'm sorry, Claire. I stood. For what? For not asking questions sooner. I didn't know what to say. On the drive home, I kept thinking about those words. Not asking questions sooner. Maybe that was how family betrayals happened. Not in one dramatic moment, but through years of silence, assumptions, and people convincing themselves that something wasn't their problem. When I arrived home, there was a message from Richard. Stop digging. That was all it said. I stared at the screen. Then I deleted nothing. I saved the message. The next morning, I contacted the legal aid attorney and told her what Margaret had said. She asked me to bring everything in. She reviewed the notebook, the medical records, and the disputed agreement. This is significant, she said. Can we prove the document is fake? Not yet. My disappointment must have shown, she continued. But we may be able to show that it could not have been executed when they claim it was. She explained that the next step would be authentication. We needed records showing where my father was that day, where the notary was, and whether Margaret actually witnessed anything. I nodded. Then let's find those records. She smiled slightly. You're learning what that court isn't about who tells the most convincing story. It's about who can prove what they say. That afternoon, I requested additional property records. One document immediately caught my attention. The disputed agreement had supposedly been notarized by a man named Thomas Bell. I searched his name. He was still a licensed notary in Ohio. I contacted his office. He refused to discuss the matter without proper authorization, but he agreed to preserve his records if they were requested through the appropriate legal process. I passed that information to the attorney. 2 days later, she called me. Claire, we found something. What? The notary journal. My heart started racing. What about it? The journal doesn't match your uncle's document. I sat down. What does that mean? It means we need to look much more closely at how this agreement was created. She paused. There is something else. What? The witness signature. I held my breath. The signature on the document may not match Margaret's original signature from the same period. I closed my eyes. For the first time, I could see a path through the darkness. But then my uncle's attorney filed another motion. This time, he argued that I was harassing family members and attempting to manufacture evidence. Richard wanted the court to dismiss my objections. He wanted the house, and he was becoming desperate. At the hearing, his attorney looked directly at me. You're chasing ghosts, Ms. Morgan. I said nothing. Richard leaned toward his attorney and whispered something. The attorney smiled. Then he looked at me again. You're going to have to prove all of this. I looked down at my father's folder. For the first time, I smiled, because I finally understood something. I didn't need to convince them. I needed to prove it. And somewhere inside a notary's old journal was the piece of truth my uncle had forgotten to erase. The notary journal changed everything. 2 days after my attorney reviewed it, she called me and asked me to come to her office. When I arrived, she had several documents spread across her desk. Claire, she said, the agreement your uncle submitted says your father signed it on March 14th, 2021. I know the notary's journal shows notarization that day. I stared at her. So the document is fake. Careful, she said. We can say the document is inconsistent with the notary's official records. That's different from proving who created it. I nodded. She continued, there's more. She handed me a photocopy. It was a page from the notary's journal. The entries around March 14th were clear. No Daniel Morgan, no property transfer, no signature matching the agreement. But there was something else. The notary had recorded that his office was closed that afternoon because of a family emergency. The supposed agreement had been notarized at 4:15 p.m. That was impossible. I sat back in the chair. My father had been in the hospital. The witness hadn't seen him sign. The notary's own records showed the notarization could not have happened, and yet Richard had presented that document in court as if it were legitimate. I felt anger rising inside me. My attorney noticed. Don't confront your uncle. Why? Because right now you have something better than an argument. You have evidence. I took a slow breath. She was right. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about the person who had done this. Richard wasn't some stranger. He was my father's younger brother. He had eaten at our kitchen table. He had helped Dad repair the fence after my mother died. He had stood beside me at my mother's funeral. How could someone who had shared so many family memories become this person trying to steal my father's last gift to me? That evening, I went back to my father's house. I opened every drawer in his office. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for context. My father had always been organized. He kept receipts in labeled folders and wrote notes in old spiral notebooks. After several hours, I found a locked metal box beneath a stack of tax records. I knew the box. Dad had owned it for years. I found the key taped beneath the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside were photographs, old bank statements, insurance papers, and several handwritten letters. At the very bottom was an envelope with my name on it, Claire. My hands began trembling before I even opened it. Dad's handwriting was unmistakable. My girl, if you're reading this, something has happened that I hoped would never happen. I stopped. I had to put the letter down for a moment. Then I continued. I know your uncle has asked about the house. I have told him no more than once. My eyes moved quickly across the page. Richard believes I owe him because he helped me during difficult years. He did help me. I will always acknowledge that. But helping someone does not give them ownership of what belongs to someone else. I swallowed hard. Then I read the sentence that broke my heart. Your mother wanted this house to remain a place where our family could always come home. I looked around the room. Her photographs were still on the wall. Her old sewing machine still sat beside the window. Dad had kept everything. The letter continued. If Richard ever challenges the will, don't fight him because you hate him. Fight him because I made a promise to your mother. I pressed the letter against my chest. For years, I had thought my father simply wanted me to inherit a house. Now I understood. He wanted me to protect a memory. There was one more item in the box, a small USB drive. I stared at it. My father had never been particularly comfortable with technology. He still printed emails. Why would he leave me a USB drive? I took it to my laptop. There were only 3 files. The first contained photographs of the house. The second was a scanned copy of an older version of his will. The third was an audio recording. I clicked it. Static filled the room. Then I heard my father's voice. If you're hearing this, Claire, I'm sorry. I froze. His voice sounded tired. Older than I remembered. I didn't want to involve you in this. There was a pause. Then another voice entered the recording. Richard, my uncle. I recognized him immediately. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Daniel. Dad answered. No, I'm making it clear. You don't need that house anymore. I don't need it. Claire does. Richard laughed. You're going to leave everything to a daughter who barely comes home. My chest tightened. Dad's voice became firm. She serves this country. Don't mistake distance for abandonment. Silence. Then Richard said something that made my entire body go cold. What if she doesn't come back? My father answered immediately. Then the house stays hers anyway. The recording continued for several minutes. Richard begged. He argued. He said he was in financial trouble. He said the house could save his business. Dad refused. Finally, my father said, if anything happens to me, Claire gets the house. There will be no confusion. The recording ended. I sat alone in the dark. I didn't cry immediately. Instead, I listened to it again and again. Then I understood why Richard had become so desperate. He wasn't simply trying to inherit something. He was trying to erase my father's final decision. The next morning, I gave the recording to my attorney. She listened carefully. This could be very important, she said. Can we use it? We'll need to establish when it was made and authenticate the voices. But yes, it may help. I nodded. Then she looked at me. There is something else we need to discuss. What your uncle may have known about this recording. I felt a chill because if he knew your father documented the conversation, he would have a reason to create another document that appeared to override the will. I stared at her. So, the fake agreement may have been created to contradict your father's actual wishes. The pieces were finally beginning to fit, but there was still one question. Why had the original judge recognized me? That afternoon, I received a formal notice from the court. It concerned Judge Evelyn Carter, the woman who had recused herself. She had disclosed our prior encounter and provided the court with the emergency report from 7 years earlier. I read it carefully. Then I saw something I had forgotten. The report listed another person at the accident scene, Richard Morgan, my uncle. I stared at the name. Why had Richard been there that night? And why had the judge remembered me, but not mentioned him? I called my attorney. I think there's something you're missing, I said. She was silent for a moment. What did you find? My uncle was at that accident scene. Another pause. Claire, she said quietly. Then we need to find out exactly why. I looked at my father's letter sitting on the desk. For the first time, I understood that the courtroom battle might not have begun with the house. The house might have been the last piece of a much older story, and I was finally getting close enough to see it. The hearing began at 9:30 on a gray Tuesday morning. By then, I had stopped feeling afraid. Not because I was confident, because I finally understood what my father had taught me without ever saying it directly. When the truth is on your side, you don't have to make it louder. You just have to make it impossible to ignore. I walked into the courthouse, carrying the same brown folder I had carried weeks earlier, but this time it was thicker. Inside were copies of my father's will, his medical records, bank statements, property records, Margaret's statement, the notary records, and the audio recording of my father and Richard. My attorney sat beside me. She wasn't representing me for free, and she couldn't take over every aspect of the case, but she had agreed to assist me with the most complicated legal issues. For the first time, I wasn't completely alone. Across the aisle, Richard sat beside his attorney. His lawyer looked confident. Richard didn't. He kept staring at the folder in my hands. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The hearing began. Richard's attorney argued first. He claimed the disputed agreement demonstrated my father's intent to transfer the property to Richard. He described my objections as the actions of a grieving daughter who had misunderstood her father's financial arrangements. Then he said something that made my jaw tighten. Your Honor, Ms. Morgan appears determined to turn a simple property dispute into an accusation against her own family. I looked down. My attorney leaned toward me. Don't react. I nodded. The judge turned to me. Ms. Morgan, you may respond. I stood. My objection isn't based on what I believe my father wanted. It's based on what the documents show. I handed the clerk the first exhibit. My father's medical records show he was hospitalized on the date this agreement was supposedly signed. Richard shifted in his chair. His attorney objected. The judge reviewed the records. Objection noted. Continue. I handed over the next document. The notary's official journal shows that the notarization listed on this agreement did not occur. Richard's attorney stood immediately. Your Honor, we dispute the interpretation of that record. The judge looked at him. Then you may explain the discrepancy. He paused. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in his face. My attorney submitted the relevant page from the notary's journal. The entry showed that the notary's office had been closed that afternoon. The supposed notarization was listed at 4:15 p.m. The attorney had no immediate answer. Then Margaret took the stand. I watched her walk slowly to the witness chair. She looked nervous, but she didn't look away. She confirmed that Richard had given her paperwork to sign years earlier. She confirmed that she never saw my father sign the disputed agreement. She confirmed that she had never met my father that day. Then the attorney asked her a question. Ms. Lewis, are you certain the signature on this document is yours? Margaret looked at the paper. Yes, he smiled. For a moment, I thought he had found a weakness. Then Margaret continued. but I did not sign it as a witness to Daniel Morgan's signature. The smile disappeared. The attorney tried another question. Isn't it possible that you simply don't remember? Margaret looked directly at him. I may forget where I left my glasses. I don't forget witnessing a man sign away his house. A few people in the gallery shifted in their seats. The judge asked for the notary records. The clerk presented them. The evidence was becoming difficult to explain. Then my attorney stood. We have one additional exhibit. She submitted the audio recording. Richard's face changed. I knew he recognized it. The recording was played in open court. My father's voice filled the room. If anything happens to me, Claire gets the house. There will be no confusion. Then Richard's voice. You're going to leave everything to a daughter who barely comes home. And my father's answer, she serves this country. Don't mistake distance for abandonment. I looked at Richard. He was staring at the floor. When the recording ended, the courtroom remained silent. Richard's attorney stood slowly. Your Honor, we would request time to challenge the authenticity of this recording. The judge agreed that authentication would be required. My attorney was prepared. The original device containing the recording had been preserved. The file metadata, along with testimony regarding where it came from, could be examined properly. There would be no shortcuts, no dramatic accusation, just evidence. Then something unexpected happened. The judge asked Richard directly whether he disputed that the voices belonged to him and Daniel. Richard's attorney leaned toward him. Richard swallowed. No, he said quietly. The courtroom went silent again. The judge looked at him. Mr. Morgan, are you saying you do not dispute the conversation occurred? Richard closed his eyes. No. His attorney looked at him sharply. Richard continued. I just didn't think she'd find it. My heart sank. Not because I had won, because I finally understood how far he had gone. The judge asked for clarification. Richard's attorney immediately requested a recess. During the break, Richard approached me in the hallway. His face looked older than it had that morning. You don't understand, he whispered. I understand enough. I was going to lose everything. You were trying to take Dad's house. I thought he owed me. He didn't. Richard looked away. I helped him and he thanked you. That wasn't enough. His voice cracked. I realized then that his greed wasn't really about the house. It was about resentment. For years, Richard had believed my father had received the better life. He saw the house as proof that Daniel had always chosen me over him. But my father hadn't chosen between brothers. He had simply made a decision about his own property. The hearing resumed. Richard's attorney no longer smiled. He asked for additional time to review the evidence. The judge granted a limited continuance for proper authentication and review. Several weeks later, the final hearing took place. The notary confirmed that his journal contained no record of the alleged transaction. Margaret confirmed her testimony. The medical records established my father's hospitalization. The audio recording was authenticated, and the property records showed that Richard had not made the payments he claimed. One piece at a time, the stores Richard had built collapsed. Finally, the judge ruled. The disputed agreement was rejected. Richard's claim to the house was denied. The house remained with my father's estate, and under the valid will, it passed to me. I sat perfectly still. I didn't cheer, I didn't smile. I simply closed my eyes. My father had won. Not because I had defeated Richard, because the truth had survived him. Outside the courthouse, Richard stopped me. I'm sorry, he said. I looked at him. He was crying. I know that doesn't fix anything. No, I said it doesn't. He nodded. Then he asked the question I never expected. Can I see the house one more time? I looked at him for a long moment, and I realized that winning the case had been the easy part. What I chose to do with the victory would tell me who I really was. I looked at my uncle standing outside the courthouse. For months I had imagined this moment. I had imagined him angry. I had imagined myself telling him exactly what I thought of him. I had imagined walking away while he finally understood what it felt like to lose. But when he stood there with tears in his eyes, I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Can I see the house one more time? He asked. I took a breath. Yes, we drove separately. When I unlocked the front door, Richard stopped behind me. He didn't walk inside immediately. He just stared at the hallway. Your dad painted that himself, he said. I know. He smiled faintly. He hated that color. I almost laughed. He chose it. I know, Richard said. That's why I used to tease him about it. We walked through the living room. Everything looked exactly as it had before the lawsuit. My mother's photographs still sat on the mantel. My father's old recliner was beside the window. His tools were still organized in the basement. Richard stood in front of one photograph. It showed my father and Richard as young men, standing beside their first car. They looked happy. I had seen that picture 100 times. But that day, I saw something different. Two brothers who had once loved each other before money, pride, and resentment had gotten in the way. Richard touched the edge of the frame. He was always better at everything. I looked at him. That isn't true. It felt true. He sat down. When your dad bought this house, I was struggling. When he started his business, I was still trying to figure out mine. When Mom died, he was the one everyone depended on. He looked toward me, and then you came home wearing that uniform. And he looked at you, like you were the greatest thing he'd ever done. I didn't answer. Richard wiped his eyes. I thought this house was the last thing I could take from him. That wasn't the house talking, I said. That was your anger. He nodded. I know. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said, I lied. I looked at him. I know. No, I mean about everything. He admitted that he had exaggerated how much money he had contributed to the property. He had convinced himself that because he had helped Dad several times, he deserved the house. When Dad refused, Richard became bitter. He said he had pressured someone connected to his business to help prepare paperwork that could make his claim appear stronger. He did not try to excuse it. He knew there could still be consequences for what he had done. I listened quietly. Part of me wanted to tell him that he deserved every consequence coming his way. Another part remembered my father's voice. Don't fight him because you hate him. My father had never asked me to protect Richard from consequences. He had asked me not to become cruel. Richard, I said, I can't pretend this didn't happen. I know you hurt me. I know you tried to take the last thing Dad left me. He looked down. I know, but I don't want to spend the rest of my life hating you. He looked up. That was the first time I saw genuine relief in his face. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Just the possibility of it. I told him that forgiveness would require accountability. He would have to cooperate with any legal process involving the false document. He agreed. He also agreed to repay legitimate debts and stop making claims against the estate. We didn't hug. It wasn't that kind of moment. Some wounds need time before they can be touched. But when he left, he paused at the front door. Your dad would be proud of you. I looked at the porch light, the same light he used to leave on whenever I was away. I hope so. After Richard left, I stood alone in the kitchen. For the first time, the house didn't feel like evidence. It felt like home. A few weeks later, I received a letter from Judge Evelyn Carter. It wasn't about the case. It contained no legal advice. She simply wrote about the night we met. She told me that after the accident, she remembered being terrified and hearing a young woman tell her over and over, I'm not leaving. She hadn't known my last name. She hadn't known where I lived. She hadn't known whether she would ever see me again. But she remembered my face. She wrote that she had never forgotten what it felt like to be helpless and have a stranger refuse to leave. Then she explained something that stayed with me. When she recognized me in court, she immediately knew she could not continue as the judge because of our prior connection. She had recused herself because justice had to be fair to both sides. She had not helped me win. She had simply recognized me. That distinction mattered. I folded the letter and placed it beside my father's. Two people from different moments in my life had reminded me of the same lesson. Character isn't what you do when everyone is watching. It's what you do when nobody can reward you for doing the right thing. I eventually repaired the house. I kept my mother's blue coffee mug. I kept Dad's workbench. I even kept the ugly paint color he had loved. But I made one change. I put a small table on the front porch. It became the place where family members could sit, talk, and remember that the house had never really been about money. It was about belonging. I also learned something practical from the lawsuit. If you have a will, keep it current. Keep property records, beneficiary information, financial documents, and important communications organized. Don't assume family members will automatically agree after you're gone. And if you become involved in a civil or probate dispute, don't wait until the last minute to seek qualified legal help. If you cannot afford private counsel, look for local legal aid organizations, bar association referral services, or other legitimate resources in your area. Representing yourself may be possible in many civil matters, but complicated property and probate disputes can become overwhelming very quickly. I learned that the hard way. I walked into court without a lawyer, thinking that meant I had no chance. It didn't, but I also learned that courage doesn't mean refusing help. Sometimes courage means admitting you need it. And revenge. I thought I wanted revenge. I thought I wanted Richard to feel the same pain he had caused me. But when everything was over, I realized revenge would have given me another victory to celebrate. Justice gave me something better. It gave me the truth. And forgiveness gave me the chance to stop carrying the weight of what my uncle had done. I still remember that courtroom. I remember sitting alone. I remember his attorney smiling. I remember thinking I was about to lose everything. And most of all, I remember the judge looking at me and asking, "You don't remember me, do you?" For years, I thought that question changed my life because she recognized me. Now I know it changed my life because it reminded me who I wanted to be. My father didn't leave me a house so I could win a war against my family. He left it to me because he trusted me to protect what mattered without destroying myself in the process. And maybe that's the greatest inheritance any parent can leave. Not money, not property, but a lesson about who you should become when life gives you every reason to become bitter. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, take a moment to think about what you would protect, what you would forgive, and what you would never compromise. And if you believe someone else could use that reminder today, share this story with them. If you enjoy stories about courage, family justice, and second chances, consider subscribing and staying with us for the next one. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't making someone pay. Sometimes it's walking away with your heart still intact.